before we move on, perhaps there's some other questions.
Sure.
Dr. Miller, what would you say to those who would claim that the early Christians practiced some kind of a socialism, selling their goods, giving to the poor?
Yeah, I mean, there is a kernel of truth in the tenets of critical race theory, which is racially postmodernized neo-Marxism. There are there are kernels of truth in critical theory. There are kernels of truth in Marxism. It's truth in Aristotle. But they get some significant things wrong. Wrong enough, number one, to lose their soul if they begin with the metaphysic. But number two, even the ethic. They can't justify the ethic. They can't justify free will. Molecules don't have free will. The molecules don't get together and say, hey, everybody, let's go right. No, let's go left. Let's vote for it. It's a democracy. No, the molecules they're slaves. They're governed by the laws of physics. They don't have freedom. If all I am is molecules all the way up, all the way down, if I'm not a soul with a body, then you got a problem. So say we baptize Marxism and we just try to encourage its ethical tenets. Well, what can it give to us that the Christian vision of the good can't already give? I mean, next to the Bible, the Communist Manifesto is the most purchased book ever, most sold book ever. Next to Jesus, he's the most influential, but Jesus is still the most influential for a reason. Jesus movement built universities. It constructs things. Marxism deconstructs things or destructs things. It has a positive view of human identity as intrinsically valuable. Marxism treats humans as a means to an end. There's no intrinsic goodness of human beings. They're not created in God's image. They're products of nature. And we're going to see where that leads eventually. Marx's justice is not better than Jesus' justice. Marx never sacrificed like Jesus did. Marx never built hospitals. Like in the Christian world, half the hospitals in the world are called Presbyterian Hospital or Lutheran Hospital or Good Samaritan Hospital or this hospital or that. Marxism never built universities. Those were all Christians from Europe to America to Southeast Asia, in Korea, in India. The greatness of the Western world in its profit, in its expansion, in its provision, in its fight literally to the blood to end slavery, the first movement in human history. Slavery has always existed. Was because of Christian thinkers. So I don't see that there's a lot that Marx offers that Christianity doesn't have. The problem, I think, Ramon, and to the earlier question, is that the church often does a poor job. And when it does, something else fills the vacuum. And that's what's going on here. You're on mute, Ramon.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Any other question, guys, before Dr. Miller proceeds? No questions? Dr. Miller, take it away.
Okay, so let me come back here. You all see that?
Not yet.
Okay, hold on one second. I didn't share screen. Okay. Share screen. There we go. Now you see it?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so as we jump back in, looking at Marx's legacy, I mean, a catastrophic legacy. Marx knew where he was going. You know, in this brand new book by a scholar at Grove City College, a scholar on communism and Marxism, Paul Kengor. He's got a 5-minute PragerU video if you want to watch that. But The Devil and Karl Marx. This book just came out. It's fantastic. He writes biographies on presidents and so forth. You know, right at the beginning, Marx said in this poem, "Thus heaven I've forfeited, I know it full well. My soul once true to God is chosen for hell." Um, Marx, we'll talk about his personal life in just a bit, but his catastrophic legacy everywhere Marxism has been implemented, there has been some good, but a whole lot of bad, a whole lot of blood, a whole lot of cost. Be it Russia, be it China, Cambodia, Cuba, Burma, the Congo, Zimbabwe, East Germany, North Korea, Venezuela. I mean, where do we want to begin? How do we characterize Marxism? If we characterize it by body count, in this past century alone, 100 million. It is dystopian. It is not utopian. The Marxist experiment has led to more deaths than any other ideology the world has ever known. And you might say, "Oh, those are just abuses of Marxism." Okay, show me all the good that it's done compared to other systems. And we're not claiming that capitalism, as opposed to socialism, is an impeccable system. But in terms of comparison, it's hard to argue with. But it's unlikely that much of this would have troubled Marx because Marx wasn't, despite having a lot to say about exploitation and oppression, he seems to have been more or less indifferent to human misery. It's like the Black Lives Matter movement that rushed through America this time last year and for over the last year. And suddenly you're seeing all these riots in every city. And in Portland, Oregon, it's still going on 12 months now. And at the same time, Black businesses were being burned. Black old men were being slugged in the face. Black women, Black babies. Do their lives matter? None of this stuff seemed to matter. Black people were complaining and saying, "Look, if Black lives matter, why are you doing this?" This slogan runs all over people, even if there is some kernel to truth. You don't see Jesus doing that. He does not have that kind of a legacy. Humans, according to that Jew, Marx, are a means to an end. They are not an end in themselves. There is no intrinsic value to a human being as a product of nature. Marx was driven less by the love for the proletariat or the worker, and perhaps more by the hatred, envy perhaps, of the bourgeoisie. Marx was not a good man. He couldn't keep his own checkbook, much less ascribe ideal methods to a world economy. Marx was, we distinguish between a bum and a homeless person. Marx was not a homeless person, but he was a bum. He never really had a job. He lived off of his partner, Frederick Engels, who was his co-author. He lived off a small sum of money that his parents gave him. His wife had received a maid from her parents to help out in the home. And Marx made her his mistress. And he impregnated her, and he allowed her sometimes to see her child only in the kitchen. And then Marx as a father. Half of his kids committed suicide. Marx was not a good man. And this goes back to Plato in his vision of the city, the civic virtues, and that all kings ought to be philosophers and only philosophers ought to be kings. Not academically trained thinking people, but the philosopher in Plato's dialogues was someone who not only knew justice intellectually, but he knew justice. It had become part of him. So that the Greek question was always, what would the virtuous person do? The Christian jumped onto that and said, I know who the virtuous person is. What would Jesus do? Right? Marx was not a just person, not to his own family, much less to those 3,000 miles away. Marx was unjust, and his methods did not help very much. Did they help some? Sure. But again, at great cost. So reasons for Marxism's failure, well, it's riddled with numerous flawed assumptions and mistaken claims, as subsequent history has shown when economists have looked at it. Even its philosophy of economics, a zero-sum game, that the pie never grows. That's just not true. Capitalism has enabled the entire pie to grow. Does it make rich people richer? Yes, it does. Does it create inequalities? Yes, it does. But it also makes poor people less poor. Capitalism has brought 4 billion people out of poverty. Marxism doesn't do that. Let me tell you how this works in common sense terms. As a professor at Indiana University, I'd be teaching an ethics class, and I would give students grades back for their tests. And I would say, okay, well, some of you are going to be encouraged, some discouraged by the grades this time. Looks like the average grade in the class was a B. So I realize that history has been imbalanced in terms of power and privilege. Some people get private schools, some charter schools, some get tutors. Some live in poverty. Their parents work all the time. They're not able to oversee their education. Public schools, bad schools. And because of all this inequality in opportunity, we're going to provide equality or equity in outcome. What we're going to do to rectify that social injustice imbalance is we're going to give everybody a B going forward. How about that, class? How many for a B? Well, some people didn't raise their hands. They were the A students. Now the F students, they raised both hands and they said, woohoo, right? The D students said, yeah. The C students said, right on. And so I said to the F students, I said, given the fact that we're going to treat everyone fairly and pursue equality in outcome, are you going to try hard for the next test? Not anymore. I'm guaranteed a B. Okay, how about the D student? What are you going to do? Are you going to try harder? No, why should I? C student, what about you? You gonna try? Duh, no. A student, are you going to try? Why should I? I busted my butt to get an A. I got it. I earned it. I thought that I should get what I deserve. But apparently justice doesn't matter. So no, I'm not going to study either. So do you know what the next exam is going to be? They're all going to be an average of C, and then a D, and then an F. That's called socialism. It makes everybody poorer. America's poor are not poor. None of them are. And capitalism has brought out half the globe out of poverty. Has it been perfect? No. But compare it to Marxism. Take a look at Venezuela, the richest country in South America. Now they're eating their toilet paper. Wow. Its view on human nature is that it isn't basically good. It's neutral. It's not evil. Maybe it can be good. It's brought on by socioeconomic oppression. But if you give everyone an iPhone, if you give everyone a Hyundai car, if you give everyone a $10,000 a year salary or whatever it is, then everyone will just get along and no one will compete because people aren't greedy. It's fundamentally flawed from the beginning because its view of human nature. It's not ever going to work. So he was wrong about virtually everything, almost everything that he predicted. Claimed that the working class would increase in number and decrease in wealth, while the capitalist class would decrease in number and increase in wealth. Neither of those happened. He predicted that socialist revolutions would first take place in the most advanced capitalist nations, like the UK, like France, like Germany. Never happened. Instead, they took place in some of the least developed regions of the world, Russia, Latin America, parts of Asia. But Marx was more than what the philosopher of science Karl Popper called a false prophet. He was an intellectual fraud. as has been painfully demonstrated by scholars after him and ever since the 1880s, after his death, people have showed that he deliberately distorted data in order to satisfy his conclusions. It is about theory looking for evidence. And so the facts aren't central to Marx. And as you saw in that earlier video, facts aren't everything, feelings are, right? In fact, 2 plus 2 is being questioned now. I was traveling with an atheist philosopher last year at universities to talk about viewpoint diversity, the death of intellectual diversity in universities because of this stuff, the heart of cancel culture. And we got a letter that went to the president trying to get us disinvited, and they called us logical fascists because logic is used by those in power, the bourgeois, the ruling class, to subordinate and to subdue those who are in oppressed classes. Even logic is problematic. Facts aren't central, they're ancillary, buttressing conclusions already reached independent of them. So capital should be seen then not as a scientific investigation of the nature of the economic process it purported to describe, but as an exercise in moral philosophy. It's a huge, often incoherent sermon is what it is. It's an attack on the industrial process and the principle of ownership by a man who had conceived of powerful but essentially irrational hatred for the bourgeoisie. And none of this is to deny that, the inspirational nature of Marx's vision. I think it's like 40% of millennials in America right now have an affinity with socialism. Or that he got a few things right and that his sentiments resonate with ours about the oppressed and about the poor. His condemnation of child labor, right on. But his philosophy spawned a range of reductionist conflict theories that tend to exacerbate, if not create, more problems, so that the cure is worse than the disease. Is there a disease? Yes. But Marxism isn't the cure. It's never shown itself to be a good cure. It's more destructive or deconstructive than constructive. Not only does his reputation survive, but among millennials, his ideas, again, are, it's making a market comeback. Well, some of the reasons for his failure, we've talked a little bit about that. I want to do just a small excursus on Marxism and religion, since that's the heart of what we're doing here. In Marx's theses on Feuerbach talked about religion in the sense that all theology is anthropology, right? That we are to take our theological notions and make them anthropological. In fact, that's what really happens, and we don't realize it, right? Where in the world do those slides go? I think I put it further down, so we're going to have to come back to that so I don't get messed up here. I'm sorry. The good part I like about Marx here in this thesis of Feuerbach is when he says philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. He's a social activist. That's how we describe Ratio Christi. We are a movement equipping students and faculty with historical, philosophical, and scientific reasons for following Jesus. He was on a move toward a just project, or so it seems, right? There was an end goal. The end was utopia, a classless society, a society where everyone gets along, where everyone's needs were met. It all sounds great. They say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. But it takes more than dreams. It takes proper thought. It takes reality. It takes methodology. I think people are attracted to it today because, one, like George Santayana said, that if we don't remember history, we're condemned to repeat it. A lot of it is students don't read history. Some of it is that history is being revised to make communism and socialism look good. When people think communism, they often think of an economic theory in contrast to capitalism. And so it is. So let's get clear on some of these terms first, and then we'll get back to the religious question. So capitalism is an economic system in which private individuals or businesses own capital goods. So it's all about ownership. It's the question about ownership. The production of goods and services is based on supply and demand in the general market, known as the market economy. So sometimes a market economy might be a better word for it than capitalist. I mean, even from Marx's time, capitalism has changed, right? I mean, think about this. I don't know what it's like exactly in the Philippines, but in America, you may not be Elon Musk or Bill Gates or someone like that, the Facebook owners and so forth, and have that kind of wealth. But the workers actually are the owners now. Anyone who owns a retirement plan, a 401k, for example. I look at the stock market today. I'm hoping that my 401k grows. I'm hoping that my investment in these capitalist companies grow so that my income grows, because it's actually the tide that rises all ships. As the worker, I can get wealthier. Is Bill Gates going to get even more so? Sure. In capitalism, there is inequality, but it doesn't entail injustice. You have to look at a case-by-case basis. Sometimes it does, but not always. Inequality is a mathematical notion. Injustice is a moral one. We have, through Marxist lens, come to understand equality as a moral notion. It has never been in any of the lists of the virtues, from the Greeks and the Romans to the Christians on down, until modern time. Even equality in the founding documents of America didn't mean equality of outcome so that everybody has the same iPhone. It meant equality in the sense that I am made in God's image equally as a black man, as a woman, as a child, and I should be free from harm from other people. I should be free in the sense that I'm independent to speak my mind and to have my own thoughts without thought police hovering over me and punishing me for certain blasphemy laws, because I am created equal as an agent in God's image. So we want to think about it more in terms of a market economy that's governed by supply and demand. Adam Smith, 1776, talked about the invisible hand of God, how this stuff works, rather than through central planning, which is communism or socialism, known as a planned economy or a command economy. Socialism can be defined as a society in which the means of production, of distribution, and of exchange should be owned by the community as a whole rather than individuals. It's owned by the state. And then eventually even the state is supposed to be abolished, or it'll just wither away, rather than by individuals or individual businesses. But the way the free market works is that people are free to pursue their own self-interest. Selfishness is bad, selflessness is impossible, and self-interest is human. The Apostle Paul tells us, look out not only for your own interests, but also for those interests of others, right? So in a free market economy, a supply and demand chain and a consumer and a producer, someone is able to freely decide whether to produce, what to produce, how to produce it, set a cost for it, and someone else comes along and is free to consume at an agreed upon price. And the way the market economy works is that there are more than one option here of these producers if competition reigns, and it brings the price down. Rather than state-controlled insurance or product or whatever, and companies that you can only get it from one place, and he can control the price. When you have competition, that can bring the price down. Fascism is socialism. It's just a different kind. Socialism, but with a nationalistic internal emphasis that includes private ownership and private production. While what is produced and how it gets distributed, redistribution of the wealth, is statist. And some of these fascist countries also are preoccupied with blonde hair and blue eyes, like the National Socialist Party was. But they're still socialists. Communism, then, is the extension of some version of socialism. Okay? The anarchists and the Marxists alike agree to the end, which is communism. One of them, however, believes there's an intermediate state called socialism, which the dictatorship of the proletariat then steps in as the new ruling party, and somehow they're going to be good and virtuous and wholesome and set it all right. And then it will just dissipate. The anarchist says, no, we got to revolt there too. We need to push revolution all the way through to communism. But communism is a political ideology or theory derived from Marx, advocating class war and leading to a society in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. So you do have Marxisms, you have Leninism, you have Maoism, Castroism, Western Marxism, but they hold that human societies develop through class struggle. It's based on conflict theory between the haves and the have-nots, the bourgeois, the proletariat, the victims and the victimizers, the oppressed and the oppressors. That's all human relations are forever until utopia. It's all about that concerning the means of production and wealth accumulation. The utopian society requires not only abolishing private property, but also abolishing religion. So back to the question, isn't Marxism and Christianity compatible? No. Call it something else, redefine it, fine. But if you want the essence, the bones of Marxism, Marx inspires a religion of revolution. I think it was Diderot who made the famous statement during the French Revolution about never having freedom until the last entrails of the last capitalist and the last nobility and the last priest were dead, strangled by their own guts. Christian religion teaches that God made man in his image. Well, Marx borrows from Feuerbach the idea that all theology is anthropology, as I said before. Marx says it's not religion which creates man, but man who creates religion. So we project God thinking. It's like Freud and wish fulfillment, right? But the difference between Marx and Freud is that Freud thinks the problem is internal. Marx thinks it's external. Freud thinks we suffer from psychosis, that religious belief is a matter of being psychotic and having wish fulfillment for God, and it might even be hardwired in us, at least soft-wired. But Marx thinks the problem is external, brought on by socioeconomic conditions. But if you alleviate or ameliorate those socioeconomic conditions and give everybody an iPhone and everyone the same salary, then you'll never have an unethical bone at all. And you won't even need religion, because religion is only a crutch for those to get through a tough, tough world. Marxism is a state-building worldview. It demands all of you, including your religion. You got to take one for the team. It's for the greater good. It's for the greater end. It not only redistributes what it considers good, and I don't know where it gets this notion good or just, but like a religion, it tells us what is good. Again, I don't know how. Religion for Marx wasn't merely part of the oppressor class, creating sort of a religious hegemony of oppression, but it is in fact the sigh of the oppressed creature. The religious person not only oppresses with his or her religion, but is expressing his or her very oppression and doesn't even realize it. Not until he or she becomes woke. Lenin said this on page 1 of his book, Religion. Now, I showed you earlier his book on state and revolution, but on his book, Religion, on page 1, it says, atheism is the natural and inseparable part of communism. Stalin said in his 5-year plan of atheism, by May 31st of 1937, there should be not a single church left within the borders of Soviet Russia, and the idea of God will have been banished from the Soviet Union as a remnant of the Middle Ages. Mao said, we will substitute materialism for idealism and atheism for theism. Hugo Chavez at the UN said, socialism, that's the way to save the planet. Capitalism is the road to hell. Look at his country now. Which one is the road to hell? Marx, a string of quotations in the manifesto. The history, and he wrote this when he was 30 years old in 1848. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. His is an economic history, and man is economic man. He says the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. There are, besides eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society. But communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality. Instead of constituting them on a new basis, it therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience. So Marx, religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the sentiment of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people, the drug for the masses. For the rich people, they can do cocaine or crack. They can get the good stuff. For the poor people, poor in pocketbook and poor in mind, they got to get Bible. Now, Raphael Warnock, Pastor Raphael Warnock, Dr. Raphael Warnock, now Senator of the state of Georgia that turned the Senate, Warnock, said that the early church was a socialist church. The early church was a socialist church. Well, that's very interesting. He would look at things like Acts 2, look at things like Acts 4 when they came together. But consider this. Acts 2 and Acts 4 both presuppose in the 10 Commandments, Commandments 8 and 10, theft and coveting. Of what? Of private property. Marxism is about the abolishment of private property. The early church, the Jesus Jew, can't even make sense of the 10 Commandments on Marxism. The early church did not abolish private property. They did not eradicate thou shalt not steal, which presupposes property ownership. The church, better yet, understood, as did every good God-fearer from the beginning, that our understanding of property is stewardship. It's God's, but it's within our responsibility. And Jesus gave a parable that he gave someone 10, someone 5, someone 1, and the ones that got praised went out there and invested, went out there and built upon that which they had been given and doubled it, and they got praised when the master came back. The one who sat around and did nothing got no praise. The problem in Acts 5 with Ananias and Sapphira getting killed was not because they owned private property. It's because they lied. It even says they didn't need to give. They could have kept the property, the price of the land. It was theirs. Instead, they virtue signaled. And they tried to show the world that they're moral in whatever way that the world and their society interpreted moral. That was the problem. The problem is not the possession of goods and wealth and property. It's the obsession of goods and wealth and property. The Bible does not say money is evil. It says the love of money is evil. Capitalism gives the opportunity to create wealth. Socialism takes wealth. Capitalism benefits and objections. Not only does capitalism as an economic system provide the greatest production of wealth for all that the world has ever seen, including bringing the poor out of poverty, even while the rich get richer, but it assumes or implies a variety of moral virtues. Implied in this are the virtues of freedom and creativity and innovation and initiative and cooperation, supply and demand, competing interests. It implies civility. If you treat your employees crappy and there's another job down the road, you're going to lose them. You're going to go out of business. It implies responsibility, not laziness. Capitalism has had problems, but much of its criticism is misplaced. Here's a book to consider on this: The Virtues of Capitalism, A Moral Case for Free Markets. The Virtues of Capitalism, A Moral Case for Free Markets. Another one by a man who did his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He's one of our faculty advisors at University of North Carolina. He rebuilt the Iraqi banking system single-handedly as the spearhead of it. He wrote a book recently called Capitalism versus Socialism. What does the Bible say? Go ahead and check that out. I think he's got it for free on Kindle. Capitalism versus Socialism. What does the Bible say? The Bible does not advocate capitalism or socialism. It doesn't have an economic system. You might say, well, sure it did. The theocracy in the Old Testament. Okay, but that was for a geopolitical entity for a time at a time. But it does offer principles that you find in there. It offers principles that support the virtues that capitalism can provide people with. It doesn't support socialism. It doesn't support theft and a redistribution or a grand welfare state. It does allocate for the poor the gleaning methods and so forth, but it still prized property ownership. It just put the onus of responsibility on people. As I said at break, the problem is that the church doesn't always carry through the resources that we have in Jesus. Marx doesn't offer us more than what Jesus offers in terms of solutions. His system ended in destruction. Christianity exploded and gave us universities, hospitals, science, technology, taking people to the moon, taking half the world out of poverty. Another interesting book to consider, a very new one, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. The work ethic behind Christians. Whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do all to the glory of God. Paul says, work as though you're working for the Lord and not when someone is simply watching over you. See, this is called character. I am who I am in the dark when no one else is looking, because we believe God is looking. And work from a Christian viewpoint is a form of worship. It was given before the fall of man. So we might look at a couple of these objections. It's not all about greed, even if it involves self-interest. Again, Paul, look not only after your own interest, but also after the interest of others. Greed is also evident in socialism in the form of envy. One man's greed is another man's envy, and revolution to boot. Socialist enterprise was tried in the early Americas in the 1600s. It ended in poverty. And so the governor finally started parceling out property ownership, and people started actually working, because if you don't work, you don't eat, Paul said. It was called the tragedy of the commons. So America, in its first landing, actually tried socialism before capitalism. Two, the rich get richer, the poor get poor, is based on the philosophy of the zero-sum game of the socialist pie, which assumes that the size of the pie is fixed. And that's just not true. Demonstratively false. Three, capitalism leads to an overconsumption and materialism. Well, it can, but this is a spiritual problem, not an economic problem. And changing systems doesn't resolve a spiritual problem. Four, capitalism leads to inequality, already conceded. But biblically, it's not the possession of wealth, but it's obsession. That's the problem. It also provides opportunity for generosity. Further, the assumption is that inequality is injustice. This is what we see everywhere in modern critical race theory, critical gender theory, critical everything theory. The running assumption in it all is that inequality is injustice. And that's just false. God does not hate inequality. He hates injustice. The Bible does not declare that God is equal or fair. It declares that he is just. Those two things are not identical. He hates injustice. He hates oppression. So now we look at just a little bit of Marx's epistemology of religion. Missing my timer here. I want to make sure it's actually break time right now. So Ramon, I'll go ahead and stop sharing. And if we want to take a question, then take a break.
Do you want to take a break, Dr. Miller, and answer questions later, or you can take some?
Well, I don't care. I can keep going for the next 3 hours.
I can see that. Hey, guys, gals, any questions on Dr. Miller?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
the discussion is quite interesting. There's lots to discuss, especially with the capitalism. What is the truth about capitalism? And also in socialism, there are lots of variants of socialism. Meaning, socialism is not equal to Marx only. There are lots of variants of socialism,
Right.
and I think if in reality there's a course in our field in political science, if you pursue higher studies in political science, there is a subject called Marx and the Marxists. And really, the discussion is very lengthy considering Marx. Comment lang. I mean, I'm just commenting.
Yeah, I mean, you've got democratic socialism, and then you've got socialistic democracy. One could be construed as orthodox Marxism. One could be construed as a revisionist Marxism. One could fall outside of that and be pro-capitalism, right?
Yeah.
And so, in that capacity, you might find yourself falling into something more akin to maybe a welfare state, right?
And not only that, I
So,
don't know if in theological schools they have a subject in theological schools that deals exclusively with Marx and the Marxists, or no subject at all. Out of curiosity.
yes. So, are you familiar with the expression liberation theology?
Yes, and I've encountered a lot of them, and I was even called disgusting by one of them. So yeah.
So, liberation theology, that we'll get into a little bit later once we get into critical race theory, because there is a connection there. Even though it started with classes, it bled into race, and that's how it came into black theology in America. So we can get into that a little bit later. But yeah, there are schools of thought in. It began in Central and South America among some radical Roman Catholic priests. The Pope at the time had a difficulty controlling it. It was revolutionary, and it interpreted salvation as liberation, but liberation from socioeconomic oppression. And so the crux passage for many in liberation theology was the Exodus of the Old Testament. It wasn't about emphasizing the immortality of the soul or the netherworld in the future. It was about the utopian vision here and now, getting the bourgeois Pharaoh off the necks of the proletariat Israelites. And so the reason people even opt for religion in Marxism is because of socioeconomic oppression. And so if that's the problem, then the cure is to ameliorate or alleviate the oppression. And once you get rid of that by redistributing wealth socially and economically, the power imbalance, then everyone's fine. You won't even need religion. It was unnecessary in the first place, right? That's where someone like Alistair McIntyre, Marxism and Christianity, he was a Marxist philosopher to begin with. He converted to becoming a Catholic, and then he tried to merge the two, and then just kind of gave up on Marxism. But you still have them today, and we'll get into that a little bit later.
And
All right.
this is last. Many confuse socialism on one hand and social responsibility on the other hand. Yeah, that's
Socialism and social responsibility.
Yeah, they confuse it. They confuse one with the other. They mix. Actually, in the evangelical left, I noticed they mix. Oftentimes they mix both. They mix them both. So when you discuss with them, it's difficult.
Yeah, and especially if you're a libertarian, let's say a libertarian Christian, as opposed to someone that's more like a big government Christian versus something in the middle that's called a conservative Christian. A libertarian's going to have a real problem with a big government Christian thinking, you're probably a socialist. When maybe they're not, they're just big government. When we say Scandinavia is socialist, well, no, it's really not. It's more of a welfare state, because it comes down to questions of ownership, of property, of production, of distribution, and of exchange. And most Western countries right now are probably, including America, somewhere along the lines of a welfare state. Free market economies over here, socialism's over here, and it's somewhere in between, right? And Christians are free to dispute over the questions about the role of government. Oftentimes, big government Christians will find support with Old Testament texts than they do the New, because in the New Testament, it seems to be a very trimmed out government. Romans chapter 13, the government is there minimally for justice, getting what you deserved. If you do bad, get ready, because the sword is coming, and that sword is not the word of God. It's the guillotine.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any other questions from someone else before Dr. Corey and us take a break? Oh, before I forget, Dr. Miller,
yeah,
you do have a book on critical theory that you can share a link.
Oh,
how do they get that?
I will put that in the chat room, but for those of you, I don't know if you're just listening, this has been downloaded for free over 10,000 times, and it's 9,000 words, a little booklet that's 30 pages, and it's called Engaging Critical Theory in the Social Justice Movement. It's authored by two of our friends. We commissioned it. It was the first piece in America written that's critical of critical theory from a Christian perspective. And I still think, even though there are books out now, it's the best concise version of trying to explain this from a Christian perspective and find whether it's compatible or incompatible, dealing with contemporary critical theory. So far, we've not even defined what critical theory is, but we'll get there in the next hour. So you can go to Ratio Christi's website and then look at resources and then go to publications. And I'll put it in the link during break.
Sir. Thank you. All right. Take a quick break. And if others have questions for Dr. Miller after the break, we'll take that first.